Many introductory books on literary theory use glossaries, timelines, and short summaries of famous thinkers. But this chapter takes a different approach. Instead of listing names and ideas, it tells the story of literary theory through 10 key events. By looking at these moments, we can see the big picture, how theory rose to prominence, how it changed over time, and how it eventually faced decline. This story focuses on the modern period of literary theory, starting from the mid 20th century. The first event is the Indiana University Conference on Style. In 1958, a major conference was held at Indiana University in the United States. It was called the Conference on Style, and it brought together experts from three fields: linguistics, literary criticism, and psychology. The goal was to discuss the concept of style in language and literature. The conference was organized by Thomas Seabook, a linguist who had studied under the famous Roman Jakobson. Jakobson gave the closing speech, which became the most famous part of the conference. In his speech, he argued that poetry is a form of language and it should be studied by linguists. He said that any linguist who ignores poetry and any literary scholar who ignores linguistics is out of touch with modern scholarship. What made this conference significant was its strong bias towards science. The papers presented were full of diagrams, graphs, and statistical tables. The goal was not just to persuade but to prove things using scientific methods. This marked a major shift in the humanities. Until then, literary criticism had been dominated by humanistic approaches like new criticism. But now, linguistics was becoming the new model for how to study literature. Not everyone agreed. Rene Welleck, a famous critic, gave a closing statement on behalf of literary criticism and expressed deep skepticism about the claims of the linguists. Still, the conference signaled that a new era was beginning. Linguistics was on the rise, and the scientific study of language was now seen as essential to understanding literature. The second event is the John Hopkins International Symposium. In October 1966, another important conference took place, this time at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. The title was The Languages of Criticism and the Sciences of Man. It was organized in collaboration with a French institution and was meant to celebrate the arrival of structuralism in America. Structuralism was a movement that had grown out of linguistics and was now spreading into anthropology, philosophy, literature, and psychology. The conference brought together major figures like Roland Barthes, Todorov, and Derrida. Derrida's talk titled Structure, Sign, and Play became the most famous contribution. In his lecture, Derrida challenged the core ideas of structuralism. He argued that structures do not have a fixed center and meaning is always deferred. This marked the beginning of what came to be called post structuralism. During the question and answer session, Derrida was pressed by other scholars to explain what he meant. He made bold claims such as saying that perception does not exist. This was a radical departure from the structuralist focus on systems and rules. The conference showed that the intellectual landscape was shifting again. Structuralism had promised a scientific approach to human culture, but Derrida was already pointing toward a more uncertain and unstable view of language and meaning. The third event was the publication of Deconstruction and Criticism in 1979. In 1979, a book titled Deconstruction and Criticism was published by Yale University Press. It was written by five authors, often called the Yale Mafia of literary theory: Harold Bloom, Paul de Man, Derrida, Geoffrey Hartman, and Hillis Miller. The book was a collection of essays that applied deconstruction to Shelley's poem, The Triumph of Life. What made this book so controversial was that it was not just theory, it was a demonstration of deconstruction in practice. It showed how deconstructive reading worked by taking a literary text apart and questioning its assumptions. For many traditional literary scholars, this was shocking. They felt that literature was being treated not as something beautiful or meaningful, but as a puzzle to be dismantled. The book sparked fierce debates. Reviewers were sharply divided. Some praised it as groundbreaking, while others saw it as a threat to the very purpose of literary studies. The term theory was began to be used to describe the conflict between traditional critics and the new theorists. For many, this book marked the moment when theory declared war on the old ways of reading. The fourth event is the Maccabee affair. In 1981, a controversy erupted at Cambridge University in England. A young lecturer named Colin Maccabee had been teaching for 5 years on a temporary contract. When his case came up for a permanent position, the faculty board voted against him. The decision caused an uproar. Students protested, and the dispute was reported in national newspapers. The argument was about what English literature should be taught and how. Maccabee was known for his interest in structuralism and Marxism, which were still controversial in British universities. Scholars took sides. Raymond Williams, Frank Kermode supported Maccabee, while Christopher Ricks opposed him. The media coverage was often confused. Reporters struggled to explain what structuralism was. Some described it as a linguistic technique, while others linked it to grammar and the structure of the mind. The affair dragged on for a month. Eventually, a compromise was reached. But Maccabee left Cambridge to take a job at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. Despite the messy outcome, the Maccabee affair helped make theory more visible to the public. It gave theory a kind of martyr and showed that the debates in English departments were about more than just literature, they were about politics, power, and the future of education. The fifth event is the publication of Eagleton's literary theory. By the early 1980s, there was a growing need for books that could explain literary theory in a clear and accessible way. Many of the key texts were written in French and were difficult to students to understand. Terry Eagleton's Literary Theory and Introduction, published in 1983, filled this gap perfectly. Eagleton's book was lively, witty, and provocative. It did not pretend to be neutral. Eagleton was a Marxist critic, and he wrote from a clear political position. The book began with the question, "What is literature?" and then traced the history of English studies. It covered phenomenology, structuralism, post structuralism, and psychoanalysis, and ended with a chapter called Political Criticism. The book was an instant success because it was short and engaging. It gave students a way into literary theory without overwhelming them. However, it had some notable gaps. Feminism, for example, was not included in the index, and the famous final paragraph used an allegory about a lion and a lion tamer to suggest that literature might need to die so that masses could awaken. Eagleton's book helped consolidate literary theory as a subject that could be taught at the undergraduate level. It marked the high point of theory's rise. The sixth event is Hillis Miller's MLA Presidential Address 1986. In 1986, Hillis Miller gave the presidential address at the Modern Language Association convention in the United States. The MLA is the largest professional organization for English professors, and the presidential address is a major event. Miller was one of the five authors of Deconstruction and Criticism, and he had been a leading figure in the theory movement. In his speech, Miller noted a troubling development. Many scholars were turning away from theory and toward history. They were more interested in culture, society, politics, class, and gender than in language as such. This shift was called historicism, and it was becoming increasingly popular. Miller saw this as a step backward. He believed that the real work of theory was to focus on language itself, not on external context. But for many academics, studying history and society was more concrete and more interesting. Historicism offered a way to connect literature to real world issues, and it soon became the dominant approach in literary studies. This movement marked the beginning of theory's decline. Deconstruction, which had been the most visible form of theory, was being pushed aside by new historicism and cultural studies. The seventh event is the Strathclyde Linguistics Conference. In the summer 1986, a major conference was held at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. It was called the Linguistics of Writing, and was meant to revive the prestige of linguistics in literary theory. Many of the biggest names in theory attended, including Derrida. The conference was filmed for television, which added to its glamour. But things did not go smoothly. Derrida's lecture was long and difficult, and many people left early. When he took questions, he made the surprising comment that he had never thought the metaphysics of presence was evil. In fact, he thought it was good. This confused many listeners who had spent years believing that deconstruction was meant to dismantle such ideas. As the conference went on, frustrations grew. The structure of the event gave most of the speaking time to a small group of famous male scholars. Other participants felt excluded. On the final day, some attendees demanded that the TV cameras be turned off. The event ended in chaos. For many, this conference symbolized the problems that had developed within theory. It had become an elite club, disconnected from ordinary academic life, and its leaders seemed more interested in performance than in genuine exchange. The eighth event is the Paul Dayman scandal. In 1987, the New York Times published a shocking story. It revealed that Paul Dayman, one of the most respected figures in literary theory, had written nearly 200 articles for a pro Nazi newspaper in Belgium during World War II. The articles were openly anti Semitic. The discovery caused a crisis. Dayman had died in 1983, and many of his former colleagues and students felt the need to defend him. Derrida wrote a long essay trying to explain Dayman's actions. He used the techniques of deconstruction to suggest that Dayman's writings were more complex than they appeared. But the defense backfired. To many observers, it seemed that Derrida was using deconstruction to excuse anti Semitism. The controversy damaged the reputation of deconstruction and of literary theory more broadly. It raised uncomfortable questions about whether theory had any moral foundation. From this point on, theory never fully recovered its authority. The Dayman affair made theory seem ethically suspect, and it gave its opponents a powerful weapon. The ninth event is Baudrillard and the Gulf War never happened. In 1991, the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard published a series of essays arguing that the Gulf War had not really taken place. He did not mean this literally. His point was that the war had been turned into a media spectacle, stripped of its reality by images of smart bombs and surgical strikes. Baudrillard's words were quickly taken out of context. Critics seized on the phrase the Gulf War never happened and used it to mock postmodernism. They claimed that Baudrillard and other theorists were so lost in language that they could not tell the difference between reality and illusion. This was a gross misreading, but it stuck. Baudrillard became a symbol of everything that was wrong with theory: arrogance, obscurity, and moral indifference. In truth, Baudrillard was deeply critical of Western policy in the Gulf, but the damage was done. Theory was now widely seen as a threat to truth and common sense. The tenth event is the Sokal affair. In 1996, a physics professor named Alan Sokal pulled off a famous hoax. He wrote a nonsense article filled with postmodern jargon and submitted it to Social Text, a respected cultural studies journal. The editors accepted it. When Sokal revealed the hoax, the scandal made headlines around the world. Sokal argued that the acceptance of his article showed how empty and meaningless postmodern theory had become. He later explained his critique in a book called Intellectual Impostures, which accused several French theorists of abusing scientific concepts. The Sokal affair was widely seen as a decisive blow to theory. It suggested that theorists had lost touch with reality and were no longer capable of serious intellectual work. For many, it marked the end of theory's dominance in the humanities. Looking back at these 10 events, we can see the rise and fall of literary theory. It began with the rise of linguistics in the 1950s, reached its peak in 1980s, and then faced a series of crises that erode its influence. The Dayman scandal, the Baudrillard controversy, and the Sokal hoax all contributed to theory's decline. By the end of the 20th century, theory was no longer the dominant force it had once been. New approaches like historicism and cultural studies had taken its place. And in the years after 9/11, academic life became more national and less international. The age of global theory seemed to be over. Yet, theory did not disappear. Its ideas about language, power, identity, and meaning have become part of the fabric of the humanities. While the era of grand theories may have passed, the questions that theory raised continue to shape how we read, think, and understand the world.